go over here now. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about some stuff that's been going on in Australia of late. I've been coordinating over the last couple of months an event which we've been calling an Australian Ecosystem Services event, and looking at some of the challenges and opportunities to integrating ecosystem services into decision making in Australia. So just a little bit of an introduction on who I am. I work for a non-government organisation in southeast Queensland in Australia. It's an organisation of about 40 people. Half are administration, the other half are technical people. The Australian government back in 2005 divided Australia into 56 regions, and I work, and within each of these regions there's actually what we call the Natural Resource Management Organisation, or a regional body. Sometimes they're called catchment management organisations, but I work for this non-government organisation that has since 2005 trying to develop an agreed framework across stakeholders for ecosystem service assessments and to integrate this information into natural resource management policy and decision making. In 2009 we did get this into policy in the statutory regional planning policy for the region, and also as a guiding principle that supports our natural resource management plan. I'm also a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, and the topic of my PhD is integrated ecosystem service assessments across multiple geopolitical scales. So in short, that basically says I'm looking at what we've done in southeast Queensland on the regional scale and looking at what we might be able to do to upscale this to the state and national scales. I am a scholar with the Australia 21 group, which is a non-government organisation, and they always hate me saying this, but it's like a high-level think tank where we run a series of roundtables with high-level stakeholders to look at ways that we can better address some of those big issues that are affecting the sustainability of Australia. I say this because this is important to actually the event process, because there is actually no project that underpins this event. The impetus for this project has come from the work that I do in southeast Queensland, where we've had over 160 participants participate in the development of the framework. As well as I say with my PhD research and with this Australia 21 group, we have actually developed a draft National Ecosystem Services Strategy and a draft national network to try and move ecosystem services further in Australia. There's a lot of work going on around environmental accounting programs in Australia. There's two major programs that are going on. One through our Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, which is kind of recognised as Australia's group of scientists, and also through our Bureau of Meteorology, you have the mandate to develop these environmental accounts. But these programs are separate and they're coming up with different outcomes. We've also recently this year had the introduction of a carbon tax and a carbon farming initiative, which is like the on-ground program to look at things like carbon sequestration. When this came out, it didn't tickle my fancy too much. It was very siloed, very narrow focus just on carbon, when I saw that there was a whole range of potential to be looking at these multiple benefits. So because of this, I went and knocked on my local federal government, federal representative's door to be complaining about all these things that I don't like that are going on in the national scale in Australia. And because of that, he ended up asking me to come and address Parliament. So in March, I was asked to address Parliament and talk about an ecosystem services approach to sustaining Australia. There's a lack of funding in Australia for ecosystem services research. There's a lot of federal agencies that are starting to pick this up. In fact, by November this year, there's 3 federal agencies that are going to be producing a report that in some way are going to define and classify ecosystem services, but none of these are talking to each other and they're all coming up with different approaches. Also, business and industry have been contacting me, some transnational companies, to talk about this, but everything's in a very piecemeal approach. And before we get too far down the track, I thought I might try and pull all these stakeholders together and talk about a consistent and more collaborative way forward. This year we have the International River Symposium every year. One of the outcomes of talking to Parliament, they said to me that, I don't know another word for this, but in Australia we call it spruiking. So they told me that I should start spruiking the stakeholders, trying to get them more engaged in this and interested in this. So this was all part of the impetus for trying to move this forward and holding this event. This year the International River Symposium has been running for 14 years, but this is the first time it's been on the multiple values of rivers. Now, rivers is a very, very topical thing within Australia. We're either in drought or we're in flood. We have the Murray-Darling Basin plan that came out last year, and all over the news a bunch of farmers were burning this plan. So I saw this as an opportunity, that window of opportunity that, you know, rivers are very engaging and the federal government's really interested, so I used that as a way forward. So on this note, I'd like to introduce Dixon Landers. Dixon Landers is a limnologist. He's also the monitoring lead for the US Environmental Protection Agency's Ecosystem Services Research Program. So I had the idea of why not try and bring Dixon over and talk to our federal agencies about this. So Dixon kindly agreed, and he's been in Australia for the last couple of weeks, helping to try and move this forward in Australia. So we call this the three-stage event. It started with the Canberra Forum that we had. Canberra's our capital city in Australia, and this was an invitation-only, high-level forum that we held. We thought that we looked at a couple of big issues that are affecting Australia, and I'll go into those in a minute, and we took this forward and looked at this in the River Symposium workshop, which we held the following week. And then, of course, the third stage was to be here today and put this forward to you and hopefully get some feedback of where to from here. So the aim of this event was to explore the potential value of an ecosystem services approach to support decision making in Australia and opportunities for developing a more consistent and collaborative way forward. Of course, I needed funding to do this. It was just an idea. So I started ringing everyone, trying to see if I could find some people with similar interests, and I did. So I ended up getting sponsorship through my own organisation, SEQ Catchment, but also the Bureau of Meteorology, who, as I said, is looking at environmental accounts, the Australian National University, which is my university for my PhD, the International Water Centre, Australia 21, National Water Commission, University of Ballarat, and Eco Insights. I could have got a lot more, I'm sure, but I had enough funding and enough momentum to move this forward, so that's where I stopped rather than exhaust more energy on it. So the aim of the Canberra Forum, which is the only one that I will discuss, this is the main event out of this main event out of this whole initiative. Warwick McDonald is the person responsible for the new National Plan for Environmental Information that the Bureau of Meteorology is trying to deliver, as well as for the environmental accounting, and he chaired this session for us. So the aim of this specific forum, because each of the stages had slightly different aims attached to them, was to investigate ways of integrating ecosystem services into current initiatives aimed at Australia's big issues, addressing Australia's big issues, and to look for opportunities again for this more consistent way forward. Now, the idea behind these big issues, in 2008 we had a change of government, and so it's the Maynard government, and they held this summit called the Australia 2020 Summit, and it was aimed at harnessing the best ideas for building a modern Australia, and they got 1,000 of Australia's leading thinkers in this room to look at some of these ideas, to come up with ideas to addressing this. And this is one of the quotes that came out of the Prime Minister's report, that the participants, they had a number of stream workshops, but the participants in the sustainability said that Australia should be aspired to be a leader in climate change, water management, environmental issues should be integrated into household, business and government decision making. We need national emissions trading, blah, blah, blah. So that formed the basis of these big issues that we decided to look at. So we came up with these three big issues. The first one was sustainable cities and land use planning, recognising that most of our residents in Australia actually live in these cities. And so these social and economic services that come out of these cities, most of the Australian population is dependent on this. But the people living in the cities are really dependent on the majority of services that come from outside the city boundaries. Water resource planning, very topical in Australia, and also a number of the Fed agencies that are looking at ecosystem services in these programs I was talking about are very much focusing about this water resource planning. And then, of course, we have the whole carbon, looking at the Kyoto Protocol, and then the carbon tax that's recently come out. So on the day for this Canberra Forum, we held two stream workshops. One of them was looking at the technical and socio-economic dimensions of these big issues and ways of integrating ecosystem services into them. and the other one was looking at the policy and institutional dimensions of these big issues. And I'd like to thank Steve Cork and Steve Dovers, who facilitated these sessions, and everyone that facilitated and chaired did this free of charge also, because they were just passionate about it and were also interested in moving it forward. So we had some opening presentations on the day. Now, Steve Cork is known as Mr. Ecosystem Services in Australia. He is our leader in this field. So he gave an overview of the ecosystem services approach and where we are to date. He's been working on this for 15, 20 years, this approach, trying to get some traction with it. Dixon came along and talked about national scale ecosystem service assessment methodologies and the program that they're working on in the Environmental Protection Agency. And I talked about the regional scale work that we're doing in southeast Queensland so we could get some different perspectives. So just some brief outcomes that came from those three big issues. So the sustainable cities and land use planning. Now we had a keynote speaker that came along for each of these big issues, and because many of these people weren't familiar with it, it was a very transdisciplinary and transsectoral workshop. People working at different scales with different disciplines in different departments, NGOs. We had people from the Minerals Council and Farmers Federation and a whole range of stakeholders. So we needed to get them on some at least basic level of understanding of the big issues. So with the sustainable cities and land use planning, there was a whole range of ways that the participants identified that we can integrate ecosystem services into this. If you actually looked at it on a continuum, you'd probably put environmental infrastructure up around the top as one of the best ways to integrate ecosystem services. In fact, that's the next challenge that I've been tasked with within my own organisation, is to try and get, we've got a $124 billion budget in Queensland for traditional infrastructure for the region, and just a couple of $1 million for the environment. So my boss is wanting me to extract some of that money by developing an environmental infrastructure plan. But at the other end, we might be looking at living walls and green buildings as well. They talked about integrated city planning, which is integrating this traditional and environmental infrastructure. They talked about, the LGs is local governments. Planning is very much a local government issue or state government issue within Australia. So they talked about local governments monitoring of ecosystem services, and maybe the state and federal agencies actually providing targets and incentives for them to be able to do that. They looked at levies to get cost recovery. They asked, a lot of this just came up with creating more questions. Who maintains the city's ecosystem services? Whose responsibility really is it? They looked at investment priorities. Maybe we could tap into some form of superannuation funding. Also, they recognised that legislation was a major driver of ecosystem services change in our cities. And they said that we just didn't really have a lot of research and information on cities. And they talked about the role of urban water utilities actually playing a big part in the delivery of these ecosystem services. Water resource planning. It was of course recognised that lots of towns depend on their rivers in Australia for their economy. They said that we need to name and explain ecosystem services to communities and the users of information, but they saw ecosystem services as a really, really good tool to be able to communicate trade-offs, multiple benefits, things like that. That we need to better clarify the rights to water. Can we integrate ecosystem services into risk management? They talked about water watch community groups, getting the communities more involved in programs. That we need a better data coordination and scale coordination from right down to the property level up to, Murray-Darling Basin takes up half of Australia. So right up to, that more national level. That we have a tendency to measure what can be measured. So we need to be moving past that approach and identifying these gaps and moving forward. And that ecosystem services needs to provide a common language, that they still thought it was quite academic at this point and not necessarily helpful, and it was hard for communities to engage with. So the carbon farming initiative they saw as a proxy for ecosystem services, and this is one of the things that got me to Parliament House. I went there talking about, you're talking about carbon tax, all the community is hearing is tax, 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 and they're just terrified. All they know is that they're either going to have to pay more money or change. And nobody wants to pay more money or change. So very bad choice of words. So I was telling them, you're probably going to lose the next election just from your choice of words that you've used here. And now we've got the carbon farming initiative. Well, no community understands that, you know, but if we had something like what we had, for example, in southeast Queensland, I could have been sitting there and rolled out a map for him that showed him where we had the highest potential to sequester carbon, but at the same time we could get all these multiple benefits from the landscape. So he responded by where were you 4 years ago when we were designing this? And I explained, knocking on your door. And but finally I got there. It's out. It's not going to change at this point. We're a bit late, but hopefully, you know, we've sowed some seeds for maybe some revision of it in the future. This adaptive policy, I really don't know what adaptive policy is, but the people in the workshop must. I don't know any policies that are overly adaptive. But certainly need to flesh that out a little bit more, to be honest. There was a lot of tension, and there still is, and one of the things I've heard about the Australian government and their why they're not so keen on taking this up is still they're back there in the biodiversity versus ecosystem services assessments. They feel that by putting values on things, you're losing that intrinsic value of biodiversity, and there's still a lot of debate in the federal agencies about, you know, the two approaches. Talking about carbon has a long lag time, but our governments and politicians have a very short cycle. So we need to develop more enduring policies to make this stick. They talked about the role of NRM bodies or natural resource management bodies, such as what I work for in SEQ Catchments, to really be taking these national scale stuff that they develop right down into the communities where the rubber hits the road, back with our farmers and our landholders. And they thought there was perverse outcomes with the carbon farming initiative because it only talks about trees rather than things like carbon in soils and other areas. So what were some of the commonalities across the big issues? Because one of the things I was trying to get them to see was, even though we have these big issues and they seem quite different, you'll actually find there are some quite commonalities, and particularly in the types of information that you need to incorporate ecosystem services. So they said all these things were linked. That was good. They did identify that. That was a bonus. That there was multiple possibilities for integrating ecosystem services in each one of these big issues. Different array of policies and responsibilities, but who's going to do what? Like most federal governments, things are very departmentalised, work in silos, so who's going to do what, and who has the mandate or the possibility or potential to be able to handle something like ecosystem services, which is so holistic and broad. They did recognise there was common information needed, especially with measuring and monitoring. There was property rights issues, multiple scales, as I said before, data and coordination came up in each of the activities. Looking at nearby and distant ecosystem services, investment, the use of standards that currently already exist, how could we better use these to fit with our ecosystem services approach. Governance, what reforms are needed or do we already have existing institutions and policies that we could just retrofit to incorporate this. Definitely leadership and ownership, timescales, the need for multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research, and that we definitely needed more examples in Australia for ecosystem services. Challenges identified, as I said, siloed government departments, finding the right clients for such tools. At the moment, the clients are very scattered. There's not sort of one client that we can really sell this to that might move this forward. Recognising this is not just a government issue, that we need to get our health organisations involved, non-government organisations, industry and business, and in Australia, I'm not sure about other countries, but land use planning isn't something that's handled by the federal government, it's a state and local government issue. But who will lead the cause? That's the other thing with no funding and whatnot to attach to this. Who's going to be our leader in this? Who's going to be the champion that can move this forward? Again, more examples. And that citizen science is not really well accepted by our federal agencies out there. But what are the opportunities? Well, if we can find a leader and a champion in this, and certainly that's going to help us move things forward. But one of the big things came out is that we do need to establish some form of national network, community of partnership, consortium. What exactly that wasn't really defined in the scope of the workshop, but we hope to flesh this out from here. And it was very much noted that this should be supported by government, but it should not be run by government. And that we need to find a client, or we need to further identify who the clients are for this, and that we do need comprehensive environmental information to be able to make this happen. So I put this up here. This is the outcomes of our workshop. This only happened in the last 2 weeks. So I put this up there, really throwing it out to anyone who's had involvement in trying to develop these sorts of national networks, for any advice that you can give us on where to from here, recognising that this isn't something our government's picked up, that we don't have a funding base at this point, but we're going to be looking for some, they'll probably have to start with some form of philanthropic funding to move this to begin with. For any advice, either send me an email or tell me today or grab me. I'm open for all ears to, whatever you can give me. So we did say some of the things would develop a strategic document from the event. We want to develop some form of portfolio of existing case studies, so see what does already exist within Australia. And we were talking about doing a demonstration study, maybe picking up a framework that's already been developed. There was discussion about the framework that's developed in South East Queensland already, and maybe having a go at applying this, particularly across, say, the Murray-Darling Basin, where we have a lot of issues across states and across regions with the water. But as I say, we've got no funding, and we've got a lot more passion and energy for this than what we have time. So as I say, any advice is really appreciated. And these are all the people that were involved and have been going through teleconferences, because we're scattered all over Australia, teleconferences since the beginning of year, trying to organise this event. So thank you.